The thing about Van Halen is you can think of a song and it can take you back to a place. I mean, that's what it does for me.
Mm.
It was like the soundtrack of high school. Their music, it's just so awesome and it's so classic and it just is good, even Van Hagar, but we can talk about that later.
Well, we can
I
agree to
mean,
disagree on that. Welcome to Rock and Roll Book Club, where we discuss books by and about musicians and the music business. I'm Dave, and on this episode, me and my co-hosts Shelley and Jen are discussing Brothers by Alex Van Halen. Alex was the drummer of the legendary rock band Van Halen. He and his younger brother Edward moved to the United States from Holland as children without speaking the language or knowing anything about their new country. With their unmatched musical talent and work ethic, the Van Halen brothers first conquered the Los Angeles music scene and then went on to become one of the most successful and influential rock bands of all time. Brothers is unique among rock star books because it is both an autobiography and biography at the same time. Alex is, of course, telling his own life story, but he's also telling the story of his brother Edward, who died in 2020. In addition to the Van Halen brothers, Alex also reveals details about the origins of the band Van Halen, meeting singer David Lee Roth and bassist Michael Anthony, having Gene Simmons of Kiss produce their early demo, having difficulty securing a record contract, and the band's earliest performances. Brothers offers Alex Van Halen the opportunity to eulogize his brother. Oftentimes the book feels like an unfinished conversation between the two. The book is sometimes mournful, but most of the time it's a fun conversational book that allows you a glimpse into the lives of two notoriously private rock stars. Warning, at some point while watching the video, the urge to crank a Van Halen song may emerge. Just go with it. Hey everybody, welcome to Rock and Roll Book Club. It's me, Dave, with my two co-hosts Shelley and Jen. Our new episode 15. We're going to be talking about Brothers by Alex Van Halen. This was one I've been waiting to read for a long time. It just came out pretty recently from when we're recording this, but I held off because I knew I wanted to do this for the book club. I thought this would be pretty interesting. I don't know, it was different than some of the ones that we've read, I would say, it just in style or whatever. But before we get into any of that, maybe I should give everyone a little history lesson on Alex Van Halen. Yes?
Sounds good.
Okay. Alex Van Halen is, of course, the drummer of the legendary rock band Van Halen. Van Halen, one of the most successful rock groups in music history, starting in 1978 with their debut album. Edward Van Halen, the brother of Alex Van Halen, died in 2020. So the idea that there's any new Van Halen coming out after that is pretty much over. So they had a long career. They had legendary 10 million selling albums. They had hits like Jump and Panama and Dance the Night Away and Running with the Devil and just like a million songs. The core Van Halen, the original group, Alex Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen, David Lee Roth, Michael Anthony. I don't know. Van Halen is one of my bands. I don't know how else to say it. I love Van Halen. I've liked them since I was a little kid. I was able to see the original Van Halen in 1984 when I was 13 at the Civic Auditorium. I don't have a ton of memories from the show other than my buddy that I went to the show with had his tour program stolen by some older Hessians that were sitting near us who asked to borrow it, and then they just didn't give it back. And we were like 13, so what were we supposed to do? You know, we just sort of dealt with it. But
Wait, pause. I think we need to define two terms you just used.
Okay.
One, which we may have talked about before, but let's revisit what a Hessian is.
Oh yeah, that's a favorite term.
This is a very like Great Plains term, as far as I understand.
Western term, yeah. It's around here. It's a term for like a stoner, a burnout, metal dude, whatever. A burnout, I mean, is what most people would call them, but we call them Hessians.
The other definition is tour program.
Oh, right. Well, I don't know if they still have tour programs, but in the old days, when you used to go to a concert, you could buy a book with like tons of pictures of the band and, you know, a little story of the new album or whatever. And Van Halen was no exception. We bought a tour program, and then, of course, like I said, it didn't make it home.
Hessian stole it.
So Van Halen, the original lineup, splintered in 1985. They got a new singer with Sammy Hagar. David Lee Roth went solo. Van Halen continued on, very popular into the mid 90s when they had a breakup of that version of the band. I'm not going to get into the whole Van Halen saga, but eventually David Lee Roth did come back in about 2007 or so, and he was technically with the band until Edward died in 2020. But they haven't done anything since 2015. That was the last show.
Well, I think the thing about Van Halen is you can think of a song and it can take you back to a place. I mean, that's what it does for me. It was like the soundtrack of high school. Dave, you were obviously into them far younger than I was, but I just, their music, it's just so awesome, and it's so classic, and it just is good. Even Van Hagar, but we can talk about that later.
Well, we can agree to disagree on that.
I love them. Dreams.
Yeah,
right
for me,
now,
it was Panama, Jump, Hot for Teacher. I'll even love all the cover songs. I like Pretty Woman. I liked, You're No Good. I liked, the Kinks covers that they do. I mean, that's an element that I like. We'll get into it later because that was ultimately a source of conflict for the band and David Lee Roth, because he liked the cover tunes. But
had impressions of the band before this book, not specifically of Alex Van Halen. Obviously knew that the Van Halen brothers were both in the band, but I mean, he was the drummer. That was probably all I really knew. But I did love their music too. And even, I hadn't listened to them in a long time. And so before just this last week, basically, I've been like blaring Van Halen in my home and in my car.
So good.
Oh my God. Yeah. Just totally rocking out.
I did a playlist for Alex Van Halen. It's, like 20 Van Halen songs, and it's all the original era with David Lee Roth, because that's what the book covers. I wasn't trying to exclude Hagar. I was just saying the book covers that era.
This is not a political statement.
Yeah.
Whatever.
I'm not trying to pass judgment. I'm just saying that the book really does. I mean, there are references to Hagar. He does say his name a couple of times, but the book ends basically in 1985. Spoiler alert. But there is a playlist. So, Jen, what were your impressions of Alex Van Halen before reading the book?
As I said, I freaking love the Van Halens. I've just always gotten into that music. I've always known their music. I think Eddie's kind of like the cute kind of, showman, and Alex has been behind the scenes. I was in on that, but I saw his entire drum set at the Rock Hall when I was there in 2016. And it's incredible. And just seeing that alone and already knowing he's awesome, he's even more awesome.
I was looking at some pictures of him and saw his drum set for the first time, or paid attention to it. And I was like, whoa, that's like approaching Neil Peart territory there. It's like,
yeah, it was a pretty massive kit. He made it a point of like making it bigger's better, like just having it as huge as possible.
I'll get you a picture of it. I have it.
Yeah, my impressions were that like kind of similar to you guys. Like I knew Van Halen, I love Van Halen. I've known who Alex Van Halen is since I was a child. But did I really know too much about him on a personal level? I mean, not really, because the focus for me with Van Halen has always been David Lee Roth and Edward Van Halen. It seemed like he always sort of took a back seat to Eddie. And in interviews, they would both talk, but Eddie sort of dominated the conversation, and he would be, you have this virtuoso as a brother, and as good as Alex Van Halen is at drums, and he's awesome at drums. He's a fantastic drummer. You're still going to be in the shadow of your little brother because there's nobody like him. There's a million great drummers. There's nobody like Edward Van Halen. I mean, he was completely unique. There are more sophisticated writers than Alex Van Halen, of course, out there. I felt this was very sort of conversational in it. It's just like he's kind of just telling you stories. But the book drew a little bit of controversy because of the frequent use of quotations from magazines. Like he would say, he would be reading a quote and then say, that's Edward said that to this writer for Musician Magazine or whatever. And it's like, you don't really hear that in books, like somebody doing that. And he did it over and over and over. It was a lot of quotations from articles about Van Halen, which I thought was a weird choice. And I'm wondering if you guys had any thoughts about that or even noticed it at the time. Like, I just thought it was very strange, the frequent use of the quotations.
I'll say that it is not common in a memoir or biography. Well, depends. I guess more autobiography, it's maybe not as common, but to me, he told the stories and how the facts played out. But when it came to an opinion about him, an opinion about his brother, instead of him just saying we were XYZ, he kind of looked to other people to say those things. And I'd like to think the reason is that, they were always taught to be very humble. And I think it really works for the book because instead of being like, yeah, we were the greatest, we were so awesome, we were the best of brothers, it's like, no, it's all these other people saying those things too. Mm-hmm. And so it lends a lot of credibility to, him saying like, yeah, we were great. And we were close. And so I like that. And also, to be fair, I come from an academic background and, taught how to write a research paper in college. So like, citing sources lends credibility to your narrative, right? So it didn't bother me, but I realized that it's a little bit different than what we're used to. Can I say one more thing though about his writing style outside of that, or the style of the book? One thing that I really love about the book is that it's both an autobiography and a biography at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because he's writing about his own life, but he also is in some ways eulogizing his brother and, writing the story of his brother's life. And so I think that's something that we haven't seen in any of the books we've read so far. And I love that.
Honestly, I loved the book. I listened, as I do,
me too,
because I am an Uber driver for children. But honestly, he's a drummer. He's not a writer. And what I loved about this book was listening to it. You were almost in the conversation. And I would love it how he would throw like a comment to someone. He'd be like, Dave, we're cool. We are, buddy. And then he'd snicker, like this giggle.
Yes. Yeah, he did have a lot of snickering.
I loved it. It didn't bother me one bit. And honestly, it lends credibility. And I think it gives us a better picture into everything. It didn't bother me one bit.
Okay.
Another thing I liked about the structure of the book is that in the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, he's writing this letter to his brother and saying, it's like a conversation just between the two of them saying, Ed, this and that, we did this, we did that. And I just felt like that brought so much heart to the book and just like instantly put you in the place of how much they loved each other and how much Alex like truly loved Eddie. So that really like grabbed my heart.
It's hard to think of there are bands that have brothers in them, the Kinks, Oasis, whatever. They always fight and it's always like drama. There wasn't really the drama with Eddie and Alex. Like they were the glue. Everyone else was the drama. They were the glue of the band, and that's unusual in bands with brothers. I think that's...
Well, let's be honest. David Lee Roth was the drama.
Yeah.
I don't think Mike had anything to do with it. His name's mentioned like 4 times in the book.
He's barely mentioned. And it's unfortunate because he does have a role and he's important and all that. Of course, but he does kind of get the short shrift. Like whenever people talk about it, they don't really talk about Michael Anthony all that much. He just gets so overwhelmed when you have the greatest guitar player of all time playing next to you. Yeah. And you're not David Lee Roth, who is an attention magnet who just constantly tries to do anything to get you to look at him. Yes. If you're just a bass player, like it's hard to even get noticed. those that don't know, Eddie and Alex were not born in the United States. They were born in Holland, and they moved to the United States as kids. I think they were like fourth grade or something like that, fourth and fifth grade, something like that.
I think they were
Their
like
mother-
5 and 7.
Oh, really? Was it 5? It was that young?
Mhm,
Okay.
it was young.
So they were very, very young. Their mother was Indonesian, and they explain a little bit about, 1950s, 60s colonialism and the fact that the Holland colonized Indonesia, and at one point they left, and white people, Dutch people, weren't really all that welcome there anymore, and so they left. Their mother married a white guy. They moved to Holland, then they moved to the United States. So they had this immigrant experience. Eddie and Alex come to the United States. They've never been here before. They have no idea what it's like. They don't speak any English. They're thrown in school, not knowing any of the language, and yet they came out the other end. I mean, do we think that immigrant experience led to their success? I would say yes, because it made them work even harder than the average person, because they didn't feel entitled to anything.
Yes. Yeah. It shaped them to who they were. I mean, without a doubt. Yeah. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Because
Well, I also think a huge part of their success is they have 2 parents that contributed to their musical career. So you have their mom who pushed and pushed and pushed and said, like, you will study piano, you will play the violin, you will practice all the time. And then they had a dad who was a musician and who understood the artistry of it. And, I'm not an immigrant child, but based on things that, I've read or seen, the American immigrant experience is very much like the parents are investing in the children to help them achieve the American dream. And I feel like that was definitely a factor for the Van Halen family.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because they came to America, they had to see their father, who was a musician, work as like a janitor and do other things, because when you come to the United States, you're starting down at the bottom. Wherever you were before, you're in a new place, you're at the bottom. He had to work, like kind of menial jobs to provide for the family, but ultimately he did it so that the kids could have a better life, experience this sort of American dream.
And the mom worked too.
And her strictness and, definitely led to, you think of Van Halen as a party band, but the fact is Eddie and Alex were very serious musicians who believed in practicing all the time. I mean, they were constantly in rehearsal. It's not like they just fucked around all the time. I mean, they might have been drinking while they were doing it, but it's sort of par for the course for rock and roll.
And their dad seemed to be the one that taught them a lot of life lessons that they carried through. It's like there were so many references to, our dad always told us to fill in the blank, and we did, and this is how it served us.
No, even in like booking their gigs and what to do and what not to do. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. Their dad gave them major, major tips, major advice.
No, you're right. And I'm glad you pointed that out, that also just sort of like the technical and business aspects behind the music business. He passed on a lot of tips that way too, which, a lot of people don't get. I imagine a lot of musicians don't have musician parents who say, like, there's an instance in the book where the dad made $20 and like gave him 16 or something, and like the dad was managing them or whatever, and they're like, we made $20 though, and he's like, no, you didn't. Welcome to the music industry. And, that they were like, that was the best lesson, and instead of just telling us, he showed us.
Yeah, I think it gave them such a strong work ethic because they saw what had happened to their dad. Now, he had a different circumstance. He had to move to a different country and sort of start over. But I think what he saw is that just talent alone isn't enough. Like, you have to understand how things work. You have to be willing to work hard for it. And you can't just relax and just expect shit to happen. I mean, there were a million bands in the era of Van Halen that we've never heard of. because they lacked that drive that the Van Halen brothers had. And in all fairness, David Lee Roth, who wasn't an immigrant, but Alex pointed out in the book, he had their same work ethic. He wanted to work hard. He was willing to do whatever it took, not just, sort of sit back. So, yeah, no, I think the immigrant experience and seeing their dad struggle, I think was very, very significant to them. It showed them a path they could be on, or it showed them maybe we don't want to go down that path. It's a lot of good life lessons learned from dad, but we want to do something different. And they did it, and it worked out. So I think it was definitely
I kind of want to mention David Lee Roth's upbringing because it stands in stark comparison to the Van Halens. His dad was a doctor. They had a big old house. I think he lived in, was it Connecticut and Illinois and then
Indiana.
California. Indiana?
Yeah.
Okay. Not in, yeah. And, just like plenty of money, all good, don't have to worry about a thing. But Dave's drive seemed to just come from, like you said before, wanting to be in the spotlight.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he worked for.
Attention whore.
Yeah. Well, when they met him, when they met David Lee Roth, they talk about it in the book. Initially, they didn't like him. He was in another band, and they just sort of thought, like, this guy, like, there's just something wrong with this guy. Like, they didn't like him initially. And over the course of their sort of club and party days, when they used to play backyard parties and stuff, they would rent their PA system from Roth. He had it because he came from Tons of Dough. So he had a PA system. He would rent it to them for $10, and they could use it for the party. And eventually they got to a point where they're like, you know what, we could just save the $10 and have Roth as the singer, and then we don't have to pay the money. And that was the initial idea behind it, was like, maybe we bring this guy in so we don't have to pay the $10 to borrow his PA anymore. And they did try him out one time, and Alex said it didn't work. And they said no. But they tried it again like a year later and decided it worked. Like he was right. And I think their difference in backgrounds is so significant because he was like a rich son of a doctor, lived in a big mansion, which, by the way, David Lee Roth lives in that house today still.
He does?
Yeah. Yeah. It's his house now because his father's long since deceased, but he still lives
there.
Gosh. Yeah.
Dave, you can always go home.
So, Roth was Jewish and these guys were Catholic, and it was just a different sort of situation. Roth was the big showboat, but I really think the main thing about David Lee Roth that people, I think they understand, but he didn't come strictly from a rock and roll background. Like, so most rock bands, their influences are like Led Zeppelin and Cream and the Beatles and the Stones. And there was that stuff too. But like Roth also liked like Louis Prima and jazz and a lot of R&B and folk stuff and just like all this different music that he had grown up with. And he didn't see that there was anything wrong with incorporating that into Van Halen. That's what I think makes them so unique.
Absolutely.
And I also don't think Roth gets enough credit as a lyricist. I mean, he's not Bob Dylan or anything, but like it is clever and interesting, and he comes up with interesting lines. It's sometimes hard to understand, but like they're not dumb. Like they're not, it's not like you're listening to, Poison or something. It's like it's different. I mean, he does have a brain behind that. So I just think Roth was the perfect person for them.
And Alex said like more than once that David Lee Roth wasn't the best singer. But I will say, I think that maybe they undervalued the power of a rock and roll like scream and like, cause all of his little additions like that. See, I can't do it as well.
No.
He worked.
Made Van Halen too,
Yeah. No, he worked for them. He just,
and he had swagger.
You'll hear Alex criticize Dave for like always wanting attention, always striving, looking for the spotlight. But on the other hand, he acknowledges that if they didn't have that, they might not have succeeded.
Yeah.
because you do have to get somebody to visually for people to stare at. You don't go to a concert to just listen to the music. That's classical music, right? That's jazz. Rock and roll, it's more visual. You want to see something. He was the perfect front man. He did do whatever it would take to get you to watch him and to get you to pay attention. But he wasn't so self-serving. It was his idea to name the band Van Halen. You know, years later, it was his idea to bring the Van Halen brothers' father in to play on a Van Halen record.
I love that.
You know, shortly before he died.
Alex did say about David Lee Roth that those seemingly selfless moves were actually like moving chess pieces. Like he knew he could always use that as leverage. Like, well, you can't say, only care about myself. I said we should name the band after you guys. It's not all about me. I brought your dad in. So I don't think it's quite as gracious.
There's an anecdote in the book where they talk about how Gene Simmons helped them produce their first demo or whatever. And Gene Simmons brought Van Halen to Kiss's management. Well, he didn't really talk about it in the book, but I just know this because I'm a Kiss fan, is that they said Kiss's manager said, I'd be interested in managing you guys if you got a new singer.
Oof.
Now that would have been a disaster.
Big mistake.
Alex's sister-in-law, which is Valerie Bertinelli. Eddie met her in 1979 when she was a massive TV star. And I know there's a little bit of juice, Jen. I'll let you get to it in 1 second. But I wanted to point out the funniest line was they told their parents, Eddie said, I'm dating this woman. I'm going to marry her. She's on the show one day at a time. And they turned on a TV to watch her because they didn't know who she was. And they saw an episode, like a rerun from many years ago when she was like 15 years old. And they're like, no. You can't marry a child. She's too young, not realizing it was a rerun. I just thought that was pretty hysterical.
One day at a time. Oh, Valerie, I love her so much. I can't gossip about her. I can just give you the facts that I seem to find, maybe in gossip columns, maybe some from her. So I think that was an incredible love affair. And as long as it went on, there were drugs, there was drinking, there was all sorts of, like she married a rock star. They were both at the height of their careers, but I believe she has her whole mess of struggles, but she's successful and she knows how to do the world. She knows how to do showbiz. She has her cooking shows. She was a model for Jenny Craig. I mean, she knows exactly what she's doing. She's been on all sorts of other cute little sitcoms with Betty White and,
that Betty White show. I remember
she's
that.
not dumb, Betty White. Yeah, she's not dumb, but she struggles and she's always had issues with her weight, and the media and people are relentless to that poor woman, and they give her nothing but crap, nothing but shit. And she married some guy who I think she was with for a while. His name is Tom. I don't remember his last name. And basically it was a horrible, horrible marriage. And she got out of it. I think he was abusive. He lied. I mean, just not the partner that she deserved. And then she dated someone else. And they broke up recently, I read, because he was all about her fame. And like on his Instagram post, he'd be like, hey, guess who guess what famous actress I'm dating now? Like it was bad. And he just kind of disappeared. But
well, I do think they were the love of each other's life. And even though they got divorced,
yes,
and Eddie remarried, guess who was at his bedside when he was dying? It was Valerie, not that second wife. You didn't even hear from the second wife.
I thought she was there too, Dave. I thought they were
maybe
both
she was, but I remember the things that I read were just like, it was kind of like the family was Eddie, Valerie, and their son, and like that other wife was just sort of like a fixture. Like she's out in the hallway or whatever. But it was like, this is us. This is our family. This is the thing. And despite the divorce and, Eddie with his drug and alcohol problems and frequent infidelity, and like that was the cause of the problems. They did have a really strong bond. And yeah, you know, you don't marry a rock star at the height of their fame and not think
They
they're
were
going to be
so
partying and doing a lot
young.
of drugs.
I
And
mean,
they were very young. He was
they
like
were
22 or something.
so young.
Yeah,
I mean,
she was 19.
yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, they hardly knew each other. And, you know, they were saying like on their wedding night, they just partied with everyone. But, you know, and that's okay
Except
too.
for
But
David, because David Lee Roth didn't show up.
of course not.
Remember, Alex
Dick
brought that up
move.
like 2 or 3 times, how
Mhm.
much that pissed off Eddie that he didn't go to the wedding.
Mhm.
And
Mark
I can't,
Anthony was there, Old Faithful, always
I will
there.
usually defend Roth. I can't defend him on that. That's just wrong. You go to the guy's wedding. I mean,
Yeah.
you do. There's no excuse for not going.
Yeah, and I think Alex had nothing but respect for Valerie. I'm assuming they probably still talk to this day. And I mean, honestly, I just think she's lovely, and I follow her on Instagram. Sometimes I send her notes. She doesn't write me back, but maybe she will. But she's so raw and honest, and you know, I think the hardest part is that when someone passes away and you're that close, it's like, well, could we have? I mean, were we on our way to reconciling? Were we, you know? But you never know, and it's so sad.
Is not a normal person in the sense that like he deals with people the same way you and I all we do, you know, like he's just in this other world. And I think he was hypersensitive about stuff. And the only way he could relate, it seems, to other people was to be so intoxicated. He certainly didn't need it to play, you know, he didn't need it to be able to play this instrument. But I think he needed it to sort of deal with society
David,
and life and stuff, you know.
Well,
David
Alex
Lee
talks a
Roth.
yeah, no shit. I'd probably have to drink too.
Same.
Alex does talk about though how, you know, he said Ed's problem was that like he was a musical genius, but that he kind of like bought his own bullshit and everybody else's bullshit and took the weight of the world on to himself because he was expected to be a genius. And how there's no coincidence that some of the best musicians, you know, in our history in America have died of overdoses, you know, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, Janis Joplin, you name it. He said there's a reason for that, and it's because you have to get past that voice in your head in order to like shut that down and just be purely creative and get to that place where you can create. And I mean, major vulnerability moment here for me, but as a writer, I completely understand that. You know, I'm not saying I'm like getting wasted and doing all my writing when I'm drunk. That would not be good. But
I like to read that stuff.
I completely understand having to do something to quiet that voice because it can be so crippling. I mean, to like, there's so many thoughts that you can have about can I pull this off? Will I get to the place I need to do? Will I create a product that's worth a shit? You know, I have been a writer for decades and decades, and I still get that voice sometimes. I mean, more often than I'd like to. Does a glass of wine help? It sure as hell does.
Sure.
You know? And so I honestly think it had more to do with the creative process and helping him get to that place that he needed to be than it did, you know, tame his social anxiety or anything like that. And that is based off on what Alex talked about, that like Alex understood that. And Alex got sober in 1987.
Big struggle as we get to the 1984 album which is sort of the most realized Van Halen record, according to Alex and Eddie, that they ever got, was Edward started taking control of the music. And one factor in doing that was building his own studio and therefore maintaining control of the tapes and being able to work whenever he wants to, as opposed to just when you can get the studio to be available. And I think that really changed how they worked. It changed their whole attitude about a lot of things. And when they built that 5150 studio, it allowed Edward to successfully take a certain kind of control that he felt was lacking in the other environment on all their previous albums.
Well, and he
So-
was free to really explore his music further. It wasn't like, okay, it's 8:00 or whatever, got to get kicked out of the studio. He could just sit and jam and play around. And I just really loved the fact that it demonstrated how when you just leave artists alone to do what they do best, you get the greatest work. There's so many influences in terms of in the music industry, in, the publishing industry, and you have all these editors and you have, producers and all the things, and it changes the art. And I just really loved the fact that Eddie could just be Eddie and produce what he wanted. And I just want to really highlight that because it's a personal pet peeve of trust artists, please. Trust them to do their work.
I think it did work.
Not a fucking artist.
No, you're right. And I think it worked out really well. I think it worked out really well for the way they create to it. You're not on a clock. You don't have to stop at 8:00. You could stay, there was an anecdote where Valerie Bertinelli called their producer, Ted Templeman, and said, I haven't seen Eddie in 2 days. Do you know where he's at? Will you tell him to leave the studio and come into the house? And because he would just work on it constantly.
The sad thing also about the studio is that Valerie Bertinelli, she was the one with all the money at that point.
Right.
I mean, you guys were selling out stadiums and putting all their money back into their shows and didn't really have a lot. I mean, they could buy a Porsche, but Alex said, we were not super rich. And Valerie was all for building the studio because she was like, well, at least when Eddie's home, he can be home and not in the studio. And it really backfired on her because he was always in the studio at home instead of inside the house with her. And that was kind of a bummer. But I also loved what they named it, which was 5150. And I'm going to get this a little wrong, so correct me, but that was the police call code. What did they call those?
For a crazy person. It's
crazy person. Yeah. And people had said oh, you're so crazy to do this on your own and build your own studio. And they're like, all right, sure, we are 5150. Let's call it that. That was great.
Well, and it's also funny because when they were building it, so Valerie's brother was involved in the construction, and they could not get a permit to build a recording studio because that just wasn't done in someone's house. But a lot of these wealthy people where they lived would build racquetball courts, and that was allowed. So they just said, we're building a racquetball court. And then they're like, here you go, here's your permits, and they were able to do it. And because it was so quiet and soundproof and whatever, nobody had any idea that they were doing a recording studio there. So we're at the 1984 album. They made it 100% the way they wanted to. Alex talked about the controversy over the song Jump and how initially their producer, Ted Templeman, and David Lee Roth were opposed to the song. They didn't like it. They didn't want Eddie to be venturing into keyboards. It's you're the guitar hero, why are you doing this? But they were all proven wrong. And Alex even said when Roth accepted it and was like, fine, we'll do the song, his contributions were awesome. I mean, he made it a great song. And I've always thought Alex brought up the fact that people thought Roth was talking about people committing suicide, you might as well jump.
Surprised by that. I never interpreted it that way.
That was never entered into my mind. It was always you jumping into a fantastic time or jumping into a good situation. I mean, that was all it was. It was never, I never saw it that way. And
it's such an energetic song. It does not read that. No. And that ultimately was their first number one. It was their biggest song at the time. It was huge. It proved to Eddie that my moving into a different sort of sound will work. Van Halen fans do accept it. It's not a big deal. And then, of course, after 1984, David Lee Roth leaves the band. One thing I really liked about the book was
the positive stuff that Alex Van Halen had to say about David Lee Roth, because I grew up in the era, we all did, where they were separated and they hated each other. And in the 80s, it was very much Van Halen versus David Lee Roth. They all talked shit about each other. It was very negative. Van Halen ultimately had more success with Hagar than Roth did as a solo artist, and Roth sort of petered out. And maybe that changed the kind of dynamic. But you just never heard them say anything positive. All Eddie did was criticize Dave, and they did. And it's nice to hear them now being like, all this distance, they can go back and be like, that was really great. Like, Roth was the right guy. Like, he did contribute all this cool shit. We needed him. It wasn't the same without him. The core of Van Halen was those four. And to hear Alex Van Halen admit to that was, I thought, very positive. And then, of course, Dave did quit. But I mean, that's music history.
Diamond Dave became Dirty Dave.
Yeah.
There's so many personalities and so much talent in one space. Of course, there's going to be issues.
Well, and Alex brought up the fact that they had made an agreement that it was just going to be them working on their material, no outside projects. But Eddie broke the deal by doing the Beat It song with Michael Jackson. He violated the deal. He asked the band if he should do it. They said no, and he did it anyways. And so even Alex said Eddie laid the groundwork for Dave to be like, well, I can do something outside of the band also. It doesn't have to be just, if you can do it, I can do it. So in a way, that might have been the because even Alex is still critical to this day that Eddie did that. I think it's cool. Yeah. I mean, it's my favorite.
Oh my God, it's iconic. Song. That guitar solo is iconic.
Yeah. That was, honestly, I never sensed any jealousy between the brothers. I always felt that Alex had Eddie's back. I always felt like he was a protective older brother, but that seemed to cause more of any sort of rift than anything else that I read about in the book. Anything that
it ticked him off because I think because on the one hand, he did ask them first and they said no, and then he did it anyways. Yeah. It's one thing if you ask for forgiveness, you don't ask for permission, you ask for forgiveness, right? So just do it anyways and then tell people and say, I'm sorry. If they get mad, you say, I'm sorry. But he went to them in advance and they said no, and then he did it anyways. Yeah. So I understand, like, it is weird after all this time, he's still sort of pissed about it, but it's eye-opening because he did take that logical next step of saying, well, that did give Roth the permission to want to do something outside of the band. And his first EP was all cover songs. He wasn't doing original songs. I think it was just a massive misinterpretation of what was going on. They weren't good at communicating. Roth did sort of see him at this upper level, and the band was different and he was this way, they were that way. But I do think that it was a lot. It was kind of like that in the Rob Halford book where all of a sudden Rob Halford was out of Judas Priest and he didn't really mean to be. I felt like there was some of that with this too, because it was just sort of like, I don't think they really wanted to break up. I just think Roth wanted to assert that he could do this if he wanted to. Mm-hmm. And the reaction from the band was so negative that he was kind of like, his ego kicked in even more and like, well, fuck you then I'm solo. I'm out of this band. I'm done. Mm-hmm. That was a big factor, and if Alex translates that or takes it back to the Michael Jackson thing, maybe that is where it started. I don't know.
Two things I find interesting about that situation with the Michael Jackson recording. One, Michael Jackson wasn't even famous yet. It wasn't like there was this opportunity to have a solo on this record that was going to just like smash all the charts. It was just like this guy, at the time. And, or at least that's how Alex describes it. I mean, obviously he was in the Jackson 5.
Well, and Off the Wall was a pretty big record, but I still think Michael Jackson hadn't broken through to, hadn't broken through to, i.e., the white audience, a more mainstream audience. Off the Wall was still very much a black record in the 70s and in disco and stuff. Thriller was when he broke into the absolute mainstream.
The reason that Alex didn't want to didn't want Eddie to do this is that he didn't want him spending creative energy in other places. He wanted it all for Van Halen, which is a little bit surprising to me because to me, it's like, well, a different project is a different project. Like, and my brain might work a little differently because it's a different context. You know, it's as though like if I'm writing, you know, a website, I can only write websites and that's it. But it's like, well, no, you give me a different project to write. And that's like a whole new way of using my brain. And I have enough
Yeah.
creativity to go around. And I think
Yes.
Eddie had plenty of creativity to go around.
And I think he didn't agree with the idea of you can only be in your, I mean, he might have said it, but that was an Alex and Dave thing because he talked about when they were making Van Halen 2, they were going to put him on the Nicolette Larson album, who is another artist that Ted Templeman was producing. And then they flipped out. It was a huge flip out of like, oh, no, you cannot play on somebody else's record. You focus all your shit on Van Halen. Eddie did it anyways as uncredited. So he is on that Nicolette Larson album, but he was uncredited because the band had a negative reaction to him playing with anyone else other than them. So what I'm saying is that I think Eddie didn't necessarily share that view that you have to stay inside your one thing. He was perfectly okay with playing with other people. It's just the band wasn't.
One thing I loved about the book as well, and you guys know when we read these books, I get so pissed off when someone doesn't tell us any of their influences, Liz Fair. So I just like, tell us how you got here. What were you listening to? Who did you admire that got us to where we're actually reading a book about you that you wrote or someone else wrote about you? And what I loved about Alex's book is that, I mean, he talks about Cream, he talks about Ginger Baker and Steve Winwood. Steve Winwood, I'm telling you, that guy is so underrated. He's a genius. And he just talks about Badge and all of this Cream music. And I loved that just to show the depth of who he is. We know he's
Sabbath
awesome.
and Zeppelin. He was like, those are the two guys.
Yes.
That's who we wanted to be like with Sabbath and Zeppelin.
Exactly. You know? And you take something from what you've listened to and what you grew up on. And that's awesome. I love that. So thank you, Alex, for sharing that with us.
Yes. You know, interesting fun fact. When I was listening to Van Halen on Spotify, you know, once the album gets done, they play a track that's old, a different track by the band on a different album, and then another band. And that very next band has always been Led Zeppelin for me. Now, I'm a Led Zeppelin fan, and maybe that has something to do with it. But I was just thinking, like, man, I wonder if they know that. And they would be so proud that, like, that's the band that Spotify associates them with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I love their sound. I've always loved their sound. And Alex said it, and I've always been trying to put it into words. When Van Halen is ending a song and starting one, and I think I said this to you guys in a text, it's just like the roar of thunder, kind of distant thunder, and then the song comes back. It's like they're like Springsteen. They can never end a song. And Alex put it perfectly. He's like, Eddie, literally, he starts a song out as strong as he will end it. And I remember at that concert, the one with David Lee Roth was there. And it, like, a song never ended.
Let's talk about Ed's death in 2020. And that was a huge part of the book. It's kind of where it ends a little bit. It ended Van Halen, obviously. It ended their bond. Alex is obviously having a very difficult time dealing with it. I did think the one really interesting tidbit was that the first person he called after Edward died was David Lee Roth. That was really, really interesting to me.
Surprising to me.
Yeah. Not to me. I don't know why.
Because it shows their real bond. Okay, when you get that famous, like you're the Beatles or Van Halen or the Stones or whatever, at some point you were just nobodies practicing in your basement or whatever, and you always have that bond of when you were nothing, and it took you all the way to the top, and then you break up because of your egos and all of the issues and drugs and yada. But you can always go back to that time, and I think that's finally what happened. It was just like, yeah, these are my guys. Like, David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen, and now I just lost my brother, so all I have left now is Roth, basically. Like, and I thought that was kind of a sweet moment.
Yeah.
Well, the band's kind of a family, and he couldn't call his mom. He couldn't call his dad. He doesn't have other siblings. Who's the closest to a brother you can call?
I mean, and honestly, this is, the thing that's so sad is with Alex, I mean, his people are gone. His foursome, his life people. And I just thought, it was,
he is married to his third wife, and that's been, I think been married since the mid 90s. So that seems to have worked out pretty well for him. So he's got a couple of kids, and so he still has that. He is sober and everything, but yeah, his partner in literally everything since he was a little boy died. And yeah, you have he's made like 2 public appearances in the last 5 years. Like he does not seek the spotlight at all. That much is clear. He probably had to have his arm twisted to write this book in the first place, because it's not like he needs the money, so there's probably somebody was pushing him to do it. That you need to get this out there, you need to get this story out there. Shelley, you need a minute?
I would love to take a minute. I just want to say that perhaps my favorite part of this book was the coda. And so in the coda, he's speaking directly to Ed, and he's saying, as I'm writing this book, which is about a year ago, I think it was like January 24, whatever date he died. Ugh, sorry. He says, as I'm writing this right now, you would have been turning 69. And the only thing that I'm in my 70s now, and I wish you were here so that I could take solace in giving you shit over soon to be in your 70s as well. And but he talks about some of the social media posts and messages that he got on that day. And there was one that said, I miss Eddie too. I've never cried for someone I didn't know, but I cried about his death. And then another that said, your music really got me through, some like this very, very hard time in my life. And it means so much to me. And he was like, screw the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, screw Grammys, screw all of those, big honors. That is the most meaningful thing to him. And I wrote this down because it gives me goosebumps. But he said, isn't that the point about art? It makes life more bearable. Art is hope. And it gives me goosebumps right now, just reading it. And I think that one of the I agree with that. I've agreed with that my whole life. Art is the spice of life. It's one of the things that really does make life so beautiful. And it especially resonates with me right now because our country is going through a wild time, and that's an incredible understatement. But, in times where there's chaos and where you don't know what's going to happen and things feel really hard or really scary, art is such an important part of our lives. And I think that's when, people are reminded of that listening to your favorite music, going to a museum and seeing paintings, reading books like this, that those are the things that do keep you going and that we need so badly. And I just hope that anyone that's feeling that way, like art is helping them through this period of time, will continue to remember the importance of it, especially, I think arts get a bad reputation as though they're not as important as, like STEM subjects. And they really are equally important because, without that, life is just not nearly as beautiful. So I just want to thank Alex for making that point in the book, and also acknowledge that at the very end I was all like verklempt, because it was just like so sweet and meaningful and heartfelt, and I think that those words really kind of do explain the book too. It was incredibly sweet, it was incredibly heartfelt, and it felt, despite the use of quotes from other people, it felt really genuine to me. Really struggled with who is the lamb, because I want it to be Alex and I want it to be Eddie, and I think they're both sweet and wonderful lambs. So that was tough for me. I think I choose Eddie because of his sensitivity to the world and his artistry, and he just did seem like such a sweet and kind person, at least as his brother portrayed him. The wolf, it's Sammy Hagar. No, I'm kidding. I mean, the wolf is tough too. I think it could be David Lee Roth. I think some people might think that. I feel like it's more like their manager, Ted, because
producer. He was their producer.
Or producer. I'm sorry. Their producer. Yes. My mistake. Because it almost felt like David Lee Roth and Ted were a thing, and then the Van Halen brothers were like the other side. And I don't know where Mike was in all of this, but it felt like that Ted's influence could have been a little bit limiting to them. Although he did have good influences as well. But there were many times in the book where I was like, can we just get this fucking guy out of here for a second and like let him run with what they want to do?
Well, and if you remember, it was Ted who suggested replacing David Lee Roth before the first album.
Right, which is so crazy because
then he became his number one advocate. Right. At first, he was like, "We got to get rid of this guy. He's no good." And then 2 years later, it's like, "Well, this is the guy. I mean,
yeah,
he's it." So yeah, I thought that was kind of a strange one.
Yeah. Also, I mean, a clear wolf was drugs and alcohol for Eddie as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so sad that. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I suppose it was smoking that took his life. But you just kind of wonder, what would he have done if he had gotten sober like his brother did? And how might that have changed his marriage and his art? And I don't know. I just think back to like Rob Halford and how he said that when he got sober, he was so afraid to perform because he didn't think he could do it without being drunk, and that instead it filled him with all of this like incredible feeling and like magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, I just kind of grieve a little bit for what could have been with Eddie Van Halen had he gotten sober and gotten over that hump the way that Rob Halford did. I think the ultimate survivor is Alex. Because he did get control of his life, and, he's here and he's in an incredible marriage. He devotes the book, or dedicates the book, to his wife, Stina. And I think that he could have definitely gone down with the ship too.
I will say my lamb is, I think it's Alex. I mean, he was just so honest and real and raw and truthful.
Mm-hmm.
I think I absolutely think it's Alex. The wolf, I don't know. I mean, drugs and alcohol for sure. For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And ultimate survivor? I mean, Alex, I guess, right? No?
Yeah, Valerie Bertinelli.
Bertinelli. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
She prevails. I mean, she goes through hell and back to this day, and she prevails. She's amazing.
No, I like her. She's great.
Yeah, me too.
Same.
Love
it. I would say my wolf is the music industry as a whole.
Ooh.
Okay.
Nice.
And I would say the lamb is Michael Anthony. The guy never gets any credit for anything. He's 1/4 of the fucking band. He was there at every show. He's on all the albums. They just never fucking acknowledge him like he's nothing. And I'm just like, he's the lamb. Okay. He's
Oh,
put up with a
fair.
lot of shit. Michael
Mhm.
Anthony deserves that one. And as far as the ultimate survivor, I would just say the music of Van Halen, because it is
Yeah.
so timeless,
Yeah.
and it is generations of kids still get into Van
So
Halen. It's
good.
not like it's just, oh, that's from the past or whatever. Everybody seems to still like it. Kids are picking up the guitar today in 2025 because they hear Eddie Van Halen and they want to be like, how can I do that? Like, so I think the music is the ultimate survivor. That's not the first time we've chosen the music to be the ultimate survivor, but I really do feel like it fits in this particular case.
Yeah. Dave,
Mhm.
if you were to recommend one Van Halen album to pick up for someone who's never really listened to them, which one would you pick?
I mean, I think everyone should start with the Van Halen one.
Oh, yeah.
It's great.
I mean, it's, Running with the Devil, and You Really Got Me, and Ice Cream Man, and Atomic Punk, and Jamie's Crying, and just there's so many great songs on that. I know we were talking about 1984 as like the preeminent. I don't think that's anywhere near their best album. For
No,
me,
I
it's
don't either.
the first. My
Hmm.
favorite's Fair Warning.
Okay.
Which is the one that didn't really have any hits on it. Alex described it as kind of darker. It was sort of like, that's my favorite. But I love 1984 too. I mean, I'm not knocking it. It's a fantastic album. I love it. I don't like the way the drums sound. I think they sound weird on it. But
Hmm.
Alex,
See,
he brought up a point too, and I had to say, I'm glad that I just remembered this. He made some comment about how people were criticizing the sound of the drums on that album because they sounded electronic and not like his normal drum sound. And he said, well, if you understood how everything goes through a microphone and then it translates that into an electrical impulse, and so your every drum is electronic. I'm like,
yeah.
dude, that's bullshit, first of all. Okay. Because when you sing into a microphone, yeah, that happens. But if you put
Auto tune.
auto tune or something like that, that is what affects it, not the fact
Mhm.
that it's mic'd. Okay. So he was making a wrong comparison by
Mm.
saying that every kind of drum is an electronic drum because it's picked up by a microphone, and therefore it's not but that's not what anyone is really talking about. Per point of personal privilege. That's my only knock on Alex, was that one little comment, because I thought that was sort of dumb.
See, I would have picked 1984 because you cannot miss Jump, you cannot miss Panama.
I definitely feel like I know him better. I mean, he was always kind of, a little elusive, and you didn't know much about him, but I I like him. I like him even more than I thought I did, barely knowing him. Because I love this freaking band, and I think they're all awesome, but I think in particular, Alex is just, I don't know. I appreciate I appreciate the book for everything he looped us in on. I just thought it was great to kind of have that direct insight into into their relationship, because that was a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shelley?
I just think that Alex Van Halen is such a gem of a human. Again, we're reading the book is his perspective, so I'm
Mhm.
sure there may be some flaws that weren't accentuated in the book, but I don't know. I just really have an affection for him after reading it. I love his love for his brother. I love his appreciation for art. And I love the way that he told the story. I listened to, and it was so conversational and easy to listen to, and I loved his voice and felt very real. So yeah, I have a much stronger appreciation for him, and really do like him a lot.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
another thing I appreciated, I'm sorry, I'm jumping back in.
Go ahead.
Another thing I appreciated about him is he completed every thought. Do you know what I'm saying? Like at the end of every bit of information he gave us, he would like give a shout out to the person, or he would say, "Hey mom, thanks for everything. See you on the other side." Like
Yeah.
he was just so sweet and kind, and he was an excellent storyteller, and he had the cutest little laugh. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I thought
Agreed.
he came off as much more thoughtful and much more thoughtful than you think of drummers, they make their living hitting shit with sticks, right? So they're usually not the most cerebral people. They hit shit. They're wild. They drink, they party, whatever. That's the impression of Alex Van Halen.
Well, that's a stereotype type of drummers in general.
Sure,
It's a stereotype, not necessarily reality.
And Alex was known as a wild man in Van Halen. There's so many stories of all of the crazy partying. I didn't know that he got sober in the 80s because it wasn't something that they accentuated. They didn't really talk about it. It was just sort of like, you do that on the side. That's your business. But no, my impression of him was I did like the book. I liked his sort of style. I appreciate his thoughtfulness. And like I said, I liked hearing him say nice things about David Lee Roth, because I grew up in the era where they hated each other and all you did was talk shit. And now he's come full circle, and Alex realizes the core of Van Halen is those original four, and those are his brothers. And all he has left now is Roth. So that was my impression, I guess, after reading the book.
And he informed all of us that the drum solo, who loves a drum solo? I mean, honestly.
Our next book will be Eternal Flame, the authorized biography of the Bangles by Jennifer Otter Bickerdike. In a way, this book takes us full circle, as our first ever episode of Rock and Roll Book Club discussed Bangles frontwoman Susanna Hoff's debut novel, This Bird Has Flown. That book had nothing to do with her band, the Bangles, however, but Eternal Flame definitely does. This is the first ever authorized biography of the iconic all-girl band. Most people know the music of the Bangles through their numerous hit songs like Manic Monday, Walk Like an Egyptian, and Eternal Flame. But few know the story of the Bangles and their struggles with the often sexist music industry of the 1980s. Industry pressure crushed the band by the end of the 80s. Though they reunited in the early 2000s, it took until now for the band to reclaim its legacy and tell their own story. All right, well, this pretty much wraps up the show. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Dave, what's the best way to know when a new episode comes out, other than the fact that it comes out on the first of every month?
Well, thank you for asking. So, number one, you could subscribe to our YouTube channel and then also click notifications that you want to be notified. Otherwise, it'll be in your feed, but you won't get an actual notification unless you click for notifications. That's number one. Number two, we're on Instagram. Okay. We post about the new videos when that comes out. Number three, we're on Facebook. All of these links are below in the show notes. So those are the ways that you could do it. I mean, you could personally reach out but individually if you want to. I think that's your harder bet. Probably a lot easier just to subscribe to something on Facebook. But those would be the ways that you could find out. So we do encourage you to please do that. And do the notifications, because not everyone lives on YouTube like I do, where you're looking at your feed every day. Some people, they need to be the notification. So definitely click that notification bell next to it.
It works. I was actually with a friend the other day when they got the notification, and I felt so proud.
Okay. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. We will be back next month with yet another book here at Rock and Roll Book Club. And on behalf of my friends, Shelley and Jen, adios, amigos.
Goodbye.
Thanks. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.